Expertgruppen för biståndsanalys, EBA, är en statlig kommitté som oberoende analyserar och utvärderar svenskt internationellt bistånd för att det ska kunna förbättras och utvecklas. EBA har 10 ledamöter med kompetenser från olika biståndsområden och ett kansli som verkställer besluten. Förutom våra rapporter så ordnar vi seminarier, workshops och möten mellan olika parter. Varje år sammanfattar EBA sin verksamhet i årsberättelsen Biståndsanalys. Den kan beställas från kansliet eller laddas ner på eba.se. EBA har ett oberoende i relation till uppdragsgivaren regeringen, liksom i relation till vad som utvärderas, samt till de rapportförfattare som anlitas. Rapportförfattarna ansvarar själva för slutsatser och rekommendationer i sina studier. Allt vi producerar som rapporter, seminarier och vår podcast EBA-podden finns tillgängligt på vår hemsida.
Good morning and welcome to everyone who has gathered here today. I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of EBA and to this seminar where we're going to talk about localization of humanitarian assistance and how Swedish actors have lived up to the commitments spelled out in the Grand Bargain. My name is Jörg Lesbelund and I will be the moderator in today's discussion, and I do look forward to an interesting seminar with a lot of knowledge and learnings to take home. The Grand Bargain was launched during the Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in May 2016, and it is an agreement between some of the largest donors and humanitarian organizations who have committed to get more means in the hands to the people in need, and to improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of humanitarian action by giving local actors and national actors a larger role in humanitarian assistance. Sweden was one of the key signatories to the Grand Bargain, but how well has Sweden lived up to its commitments? I will soon welcome our first speakers, but I need to point out a few practical details. Restrooms are downstairs, and the emergency exits are found one in the back of the room, one on the side here. There will be no mask falling from the roof if we lose cabin pressure. To kick off this seminar, we have a presentation of the report, Supporting Local Actors, Evaluation of Sweden's Application to the Grand Bargain's Localization Agenda. And at 11:15, we open up the floor for questions. At 11:30, we end the seminar. I would now like to hand over to the authors of the report, Sophia Swithern, independent consultant based in Oxford, the UK. Welcome. Charlotte Latimer, also independent consultant based in Chamonix, Mont Blanc in France. And to Teddy Atom, independent consultant based in Kampala in Uganda. I also want to mention that you have had a very dedicated team of researchers in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, Ukraine, to support you in the work. And I would like to hand over to a pre-recorded message from Teddy Atom in Uganda.
Thank you for inviting us to share the findings of our research with you today. We began this expert group for Aid Studies Commission research about 16 months ago. Much has changed in that period and continues to change, not just in the humanitarian crisis unfolding in the world, but also in Sweden's approach to aid. But the rationale behind this research is valid. There was a clear need for robust evidence to understand and underpin Sweden's efforts to make progress to localize humanitarian action. Let's briefly remind ourselves where these localization commitments came from. Even though local national actors are central to the delivery of humanitarian assistance and its sustainability, they have been marginalized by an international humanitarian system which has dominated power and resources. This puts local national actors in an unjust and precarious position, but it's also potentially detrimental to the effectiveness, relevance, and sustainability of humanitarian action. The 2016 World Humanitarian Summit made commitments, including localization commitments in the Grand Bargain on humanitarian aid. to change the status quo and make international humanitarian aid more equitable and representative of local national actors. Sweden and its partner organizations are signatories to this agreement. But what has happened 7 years on? There is very limited progress to fulfill the localization commitments, with most donors, including Sweden, failing to live up to its commitments. For example, in 2022, only 1.2% of international humanitarian aid went directly to local national actors, which is below the 25% agreed target. Nonetheless, some major donors, including the US and European Commission, have recently articulated their plans and strategies for action. This is mounting pressure on Sweden to be clear on its localization position. But the challenge is how it can align retrospectively its commitment with its diverse partners' interpretation of localization. But there is room for Sweden to learn from and build on others' approaches. At the time of undertaking this research, Sida's Unit for Humanitarian Assistance had a localization task team that developed a policy brief and was also trying to pilot direct funding to local national actors in select countries. They were also developing a new development strategy and guide for Sweden's humanitarian action. How did our research unfold? Throughout the entire process, even though it was commissioned by the expert group for aid studies, we had extensive consultation with Sida's humanitarian unit, which offered useful guidance for this research. And to define the parameters for this study, we relied on the Grand Bargain commitments as a starting point, and later build on the established localization parameters and performance. And to undertake this research, we had a diverse team of researchers. One of our core team members was from the Global South, but we also worked with country consultants from the case study countries, who included Gang Karume from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Katrina Dimitrov from Ukraine, and Cherry from Myanmar. I'll now pass them to my colleague Charlotte to take us through the main findings of the research. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So following up on that introduction from Teddy, I'm going to talk you through the findings of the research, and then I'll hand over to Sophia, who will take us through conclusions and into the way forward. I just want to put up on the screen this visual of how we organised the findings, or how we organised our thinking, because localisation can mean different things to different people. And we came up with this model which looked at different international frameworks on localization and picked out these 6 main areas. And these are the sort of headings for our findings. So I'll talk you through them one by one. So if we start with strategy, what we found is that generally people felt that Sweden does prioritize localization. There's a strong commitment to the Grand Bargain commitment. But without a clear strategy, at least at the time that we were researching and writing the report, without a clear strategy or a policy that spelled that out. So that meant that stakeholders felt unclear as to what that actually meant in practice and how to put it into practice themselves. So we saw inconsistencies in the way that, for example, country teams, Sweden in-house country teams, but also between Sida and MFA, some different understandings and different levels of prioritization. And even within Sida, some different interpretations. And then looking at Sweden's partners, so without that strong steer from Sweden, we saw then that partners interpreted it differently. And they tended to be risk averse. So without a clear understanding of what it actually meant, they tended to err on the side of caution, and particularly in terms of passing financing to local actors, they tended to be quite risk averse. And what we termed in the report, or what we heard from one of our stakeholders, was that there was a tendency towards destructive risk aversion. So that's the amount of funding that actually gets passed on to local actors and the type of funding that's passed on. We also heard that Sweden was thought to be a quiet donor on localization, and we know that Sweden is not generally a quiet donor, that Sweden is very vocal on certain issues, and there are certain topics where they're reliably a strong and vocal donor. So on needs-based assistance, for example, or on humanitarian principles, where they're reliably assertive. But on this topic of localization, generally seen to be quiet. And there were definitely calls from both within Sweden and externally for Sweden to step up and be more assertive and more vocal on this topic. If we look at funding, I think we all know, and we could certainly see from the data, there's no direct Swedish funding that reaches local and national actors, not at this stage. And so the funding that does reach local actors is going through intermediaries. So that's going through international NGOs, through UN agencies, and through the pooled funds. And we use the figure, which is Sida's own estimate of how much of its funding is reaching local actors, and that's a figure of 17%. We found that the funding that is passed on to local actors is generally due to the flexibility of Sweden's funding, which is really prized. It was a real strength of Sweden's funding as a donor that it does provide flexible funding to its partners, which in some cases allows for the passing on of funding to local actors, but it's largely left to the discretion of those international actors. So it's not necessarily that Sweden demands or even necessarily enables the passing on of funding. It was really difficult to get to the figure. We tried ourselves to gather data to understand how much was reaching international actors, and the inconsistencies in reporting made it really difficult, as well as other challenges. Make it very difficult to actually track progress. So we know that Sweden is trying to do that itself. Sida is trying to do that. We struggled with that too. We looked at why more funding doesn't go directly from Sweden to local actors, and we looked at the barriers. And they're quite obvious in a way. And I think the main one, the one that came out most strongly, was around the administrative burden for Sweden of being able to actually manage multiple smaller grants to more local organizations. So that's really something that is that administrative capacity and the bureaucracy around that is a real challenge. But we also heard about the low risk tolerance or risk appetite that Sweden has, being somehow contradictory to its ambitions on localization. So on the one hand, particularly on the sort of humanitarian policy side, some really strong messages on localization. On the other hand, the sort of audit side of the house or the controller side of the house being much more risk averse and making that transfer of funding more difficult. We looked at the quantity of funding, but we also looked at the quality of the funding, and that can mean lots of different things. So we asked mainly local actors, what do they mean when they talk about quality of funding? And the thing that came out most strongly from those conversations was the passing on of overheads. So that's the administrative cost to allow those organizations to keep going and to invest in their own capacity. And that's generally, there's very varying practice on the passing on of overheads. And also the passing on of multi-year support, so longer term funding for local actors. Even though Sweden does provide multi-year support to some of its international partners, that's not necessarily, and in fact quite rarely, passed on to local partners. If I move on to partnership, what we found is that the quality of partnerships was very important in Sweden. Sida paying a lot of attention to the quality of its own partnerships with its international partners and the quality of international and local partners, but different understandings of what that actually meant. So no real clarity on what quality looks like. So there's inconsistency in the way that's applied. We also found that the equal access to partnerships was uneven. So mainly because of these very rigorous, these quite difficult eligibility requirements. These are Sweden's own eligibility requirements to be partners, but also the requirements of international partners, where it's difficult for a lot of smaller organizations to meet those requirements working in quite difficult contexts. And what that meant was that there tended to be a gravitation towards a small set of national NGOs, for example, who can already meet the requirements, leaving a whole swathe of smaller civil society organizations who would find it very difficult to ever meet those standards. We looked at the issue of risk, and we found when we talked to people about risk, generally what people meant is risk to, when we talk to people in Sida, as well as international partners, when they talk about risk, it's usually risk to them, risk to them of working with local partners, and mainly around the financial risks that they take. Very little focus on the risks that those local actors actually take in often working in very insecure environments, in hard to reach places, where there wasn't that sort of sharing of risk or even understanding of what risks those local actors were taking. Very quickly on capacity strengthening, a bit of attention, and it links to that previous point on the Sweden's life-saving priority and building the capacity of those local actors to become the best placed actor to meet those life-saving priorities. We looked at what kind of capacity building was going on. It tended to focus on top-down sort of international compliance requirements rather than the sort of capacity building that local actors themselves might prioritize. We did see a lot of good practice on the development side of the house with CivSam, for example, the work that's going on there and capacity strengthening. So lots of potential for crossover to the humanitarian side. Lastly, on knowledge, we looked at Sweden's support for generating evidence on localization, as well as the extent to which that evidence was locally led or locally, there was local participation. There is some investment in knowledge generation on localization, but it tends to be piecemeal. And unsurprisingly, it tends to be led by internationals, even though there was a really strong appetite expressed to us for more localized evidence generation. Again, really good practice in-house on the research side that could cross over to the humanitarian side of the house. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Sophia, who will talk us through conclusions and ways forward.
Oh no, I'm mic'd up, aren't I? Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Great, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you to Teddy as well for a really succinct, heroically succinct outline of what is. It's a big report, and Matt's reminded us that this is without the annexes. I think there's another 100 pages lurking there on the internet for those of you that need some additional bedtime reading, just to reassure you of the robustness of our findings. So there's a lot to make sense of in there. There's a lot of detail, but there's also overarching conclusions. So what I'm going to quickly do now, building on what Teddy's given us on the context, what Charlotte's talked us through with the findings, is to give you a flavour of the so what. The what does this all mean? What do we conclude? Can you hear me? Ah, wonderful. Thank you. So we put our findings or our conclusions into 7 buckets, and we called them 4 broadly sort of normative shifts, 4 kind of mindset changes, normative shifts that we want to see, and 3 areas of practical action. So starting with these normative shifts here, the first was around prioritising localisation. So this is around sending the signal, Sweden sending the signal that localisation is a priority for Sweden's humanitarian aid. So effective, principled, life-saving support is still definitely the primary aim of Sweden's humanitarian assistance. But as well as just seeing local and national actors as a means to this end, particularly in the difficult places to which international actors can't act, we wanted to suggest that Sida add localization as an explicit secondary priority in its own right. And we see this done in the UN's country-based pooled funds, where obviously life-saving humanitarian aid is the primary aim, but localization is in there as a secondary. And there's an opportunity here with the rollout of Sida's new guidance, which I'm sure we'll hear about, to signal this prioritisation. The second normative shift was around balancing flexibility with assertiveness, and this was one of the trickiest dilemmas, balances that we encountered in the findings. We repeatedly heard, nearly everybody we spoke to, internally and externally, we repeatedly heard that Swedish aid is so highly valued because of the flexibility it offers and what that flexibility gives. So it allows partners to adapt in volatile settings, to cover essential running costs, and also to allow them the space and the innovation to work on localization within their institutions. But at the same time, a lot of those same organizations that enjoyed and valued that flexibility also called themselves to Sweden to be more assertive, to be tougher with them, to be bolder with them, and more exacting on its localization expectations. And this doesn't mean that they suddenly need to change overnight to being micromanagers, but to use the existing points in the partnership process to ask those questions and be more exacting on localization. The next point around adapting risk management is something that Charlotte covered quite extensively there, which was the need to rethink approaches to risk. Of course, Sweden needs to responsibly manage the risks around humanitarian aid, but we also heard about this destructive risk aversion that Charlotte spoke about, and that partners often chose a safe option and didn't go as far as they wanted to or they might have done on supporting local actors because they were afraid of what the financial controllers might say. So overcoming this is going to need some joined up conversations internally between the operational and the audit functions, but also involving from the start those local partners in some smart conversations around co-ownership of risks and thinking about the risks to them rather than just the risks of them, and that this came out as particularly an ethical imperative, given that Sweden relies so much on local national actors to deliver at the last mile. The last normative shift was around this idea of improving sustainability. So this cut through all of our findings, was that localization demands sustained engagement, and that again, Sweden has the tools for this. It's valued for its multi-year funding, but we need to see the benefits of that multi-year funding passed on to local and national actors from the international organizations that benefit that. And that's particularly the case for UN agencies. And that needs to be part of a wider attention to local and national actors' institutional sustainability, which involves also ethical recruitment practices, so that we don't see this common phenomenon of brain drain where international organizations come into humanitarian context and staff from local national actors migrate quite quickly to working for UN organizations, undermining those institutions. So alongside those four normative shifts, we had these three practical considerations, which I'll run through very quickly. So one of which was the first for Sweden to move away from being that quiet donor and to use its considerable soft power, the respect that it has accrued over decades of work on good humanitarian donorship on the global stage, to be more joined up and more vocal on localization. And as it uses its voice, to use also its opportunities and global fora to bring local and national actors to the table with it. The next one is around improving internal coordination. So we've talked a little bit about some of those opportunities for link up between the audit and the operational functions. Good to see MFA and Sida sitting side by side here. This need for the funding that's channeled through the MFA to be speaking with one voice with the funding that's channeled through Sida, again, particularly to UN agencies, is key. And this need for a concerted Team Sweden approach that uses all that know-how and knowledge from the development side of house around locally led development, around civil society strengthening, and a nexus approach to localization. And then finally, this point around investing for change, which I know is particularly front of mind for many of you at the moment, and that's that need to be realistic about the scale of resources that it takes. In the long term, localization may bring cost cutting, but in the short term, it's going to demand some thinking about how to both give international partners the resources they need to support local and national partners, but also to invest sufficient human resources in institutions. And I'm just going to close now with the words. I think it's important to give the last words to the local and national partners who were so helpful in responding to our surveys and speaking to our colleagues in DRC and Myanmar and Ukraine. And our colleague Chiri in Myanmar spoke to some amazing local national organisations. And one of the words of one of them stuck with me particularly. They wanted us to remind Sweden, and I will give them here the final words, localisation is a power relationship, they said. Localisation is also a moral responsibility. It has to be an ethical approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. Teddy, Charlotte, Sophia. Sophia, if you'd like to stay on. We're now going to move into our panel discussion. And after that, you will have the opportunity to put some questions to our panelists. I would like to introduce to you our panel. So we have Anna Ram, Deputy Humanitarian Director at Sida. Welcome. We have Anders Pedersen, International Director, Swedish Red Cross. Sofia Karlsson, Deputy Director at the Swedish... you can't hear me, can you? Now it's on. Yeah, Deputy... Sofia Karlsson, Deputy Director at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Head of Humanitarian Division. And Erik Lusén, there you are. Thank you. Director ACT Church of Sweden and Chair International ACT Alliance. Can we have some more glasses, please? Welcome very much. So, to get the discussion going, I'd like to start by asking you all a very short question. And I would like you to answer yes or no. And that's all you get for now. And then we're going to dig deeper into your arguments a little bit later. But if we start with the 25%, one of the core commitments of the Grand Bargain is to get at least 25% of humanitarian funding channeled to local and national actors as directly as possible. And as we heard from the presentation here, Sweden's estimated indirect funding stands at about 17%. And I would like to hear from your perspective and your experiences if you think that this figure gives a fair indication of how well Sweden has fulfilled its commitments. Yes and no. And I will start with you, Anna.
Anna.
Sorry.
Yes, but.
Yes, but. And we have Anders.
No, but.
No, but. And then we have Sofia. Sofia Karlsson. Yes,
I would say yes.
You would say yes. And we've had Erik.
No, but.
No, but. And Sofia Sweden.
Am I allowed a researcher's maybe?
Oh, right. Maybe. All right. So I would like to start with the yes, but. So Anna and Sofia Karlsson, you both said Anna and Erik, you said yes, but Anna.
No. I said actually no.
No.
Two no's and two yes.
Surprisingly, we have 2 no's and 2 yes.
Yes. But Anna, yes, but.
Should I start?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, of course, I think quantity matters, and in a sense, 17%, we've come somewhere. I think it's very important for us to really have the ambition to reach the 25% goal, at least. And that's really within our plans as well. But from a quantitative perspective, I think there is more to localization than just these numbers and funding levels. I mean, when it comes to providing more autonomy of local actors, involving them in decision-making, participation, and also, of course, working more closely together with local actors and affected communities would be equally important in an approach. And we try to have that broad approach to localization at Sida.
Right. And thank you. And then we have the yes but no but. Sofia Karlsson.
Well, maybe not no but I think the estimate figure of 17% is probably fair enough. That is where we are at this point. I do have to say that we can do better. We can do better in line of the Grand Bargain commitment of 25%, and this is also something that the government has recognized, setting out the target of 25% as the Grand Bargain target is, also in the newly adopted agenda for reform of the development assistance. So there is a clear goal in that agenda as well that we will try to reach.
Right. And we have the two no buts. Eric?
Well, yes, I was saying no, but in the sense that, and I think it points to what you said, Anna, that talking about localization and Sweden's application of the Grand Bargain commitment, it really contains all these 6 different dimensions. That Sida is really assertive about it in its policies and its guidelines. So it goes beyond sort of the figures, but the figures are also important. So, but that's also self-reported estimate, 17%, because you don't track sort of the pass-on of funds through the strategic partner organization. So it's a bit unclear as well whether we actually are at 17% or not.
Right. We'll come back to that. And Anders?
No, I think I of course agree with what has been said in that regard, but I thought that last quote of yours that you actually made from the colleague in the DRC is we have to be very, very careful, and I always get a little bit uncomfortable when the conversation on localization starts with the levels of funding. Number one, it's exceptionally difficult to track, and having been on the other side and the recipient of the UN pass-on funds, I can tell you it's not that simple, that they are kind of flexible and completely free, etc., etc. There are so many buts to that one. But really, to be very, very clear, this is about a fundamental power imbalance. And I think the conversation has to start there. And I think what's interesting with the localization agenda is that this is one of those areas where the commitment has been there for decades. And of course, the Grand Bargain is just one of them. It's absolutely clear that we all see that this is the only way to actually get very efficient and effective response on the ground. Nevertheless, it's exceptionally difficult to get there. And having been on the ground for more than 20 years myself at the recipient side, I can just tell you, it's exceptionally difficult to actually get those words into the proper action and get the local actors to actually feel that they are in the driver's seat. So it has to start there.
It has to start there. Very good. Just with the maybe, Sofia Swithin, please.
Yes. So I think it's probably worth us talking a little bit about how we tried to get some of these figures. We came in with high hopes and optimism that we were going to try and generate some more precise figures. We did actually ask all of Sida's international partners to give us figures if they had any, so that we could come up with something more accurate than this 17% estimate. We weren't able to. So I think only about 4 out of 20 partners were able to give us decent data. We got some other partial data in. It wasn't really comparable. Now, there's very clear technical reasons why it's hard to give the data, particularly if you've got flexible funding. It all comes into a general budget line from lots of different donors. Tracking then what goes out is hard, but we could be, or Sweden could be doing better on tracking, and Sweden's not alone in this. I think it's something that all donors are struggling with. And I think just very quickly to follow up on your other points there, I think that point on quality is key. I think 100 krona, if you're being subcontracted, told what to do in a top-down way in a short time frame, is not worth the same amount of money as 100 krona if you're a local national actor being given it. And then the other point is what this 17% estimate masks, and I think this is something that also came up when we were talking to different organisations, is that there are some INGOs who are really doing some amazing work on this. And so does that 17%, is it being carried by a few organisations and other organisations giving a much smaller percentage? We'd like to see more consistency in everybody making that effort to the best of their organisational ability.
Thank you. I would like to pick up on the power imbalance, and that, I mean, localization is there are commitments, but there are it's also difficult, as we heard, to fulfill these commitments. I mean, very briefly, just like the obstacles to overcome and how do we fulfill it? I mean, what are the hurdles? If we're talking about a power imbalance, Anders, can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
I mean, first and foremost, I think just the language is number one. Word matters, and the way that we speak to this. We speak still about contracting partners. We speak about intermediaries. The way that we look at the local national actors, it's all an agenda, kind of a vocabulary that people like us have actually established. The whole system is very much based on those kind of north-south, and it's from top down. I mean, that's a reality, and I'm standing between friends, and I think Eric and I will actually really recognize we are in a very good place. Sweden is absolutely one of the most progressive donors, no question about that. But nevertheless, I think it has to be said, as an international system, we are struggling with this one. And I think one of the last actually recommendations from the research is absolutely key, that you look at this as a number of dimensions that have to be taken upon simultaneously. There's no one size fits all, and there's no one thing this will actually make it. It's collectively. And we have to make some very difficult choices in between very legitimate interests. It's very, very difficult to simultaneously be focusing on the localization and building the capacity of the local actors, and simultaneously say that in every moment it's best placed, it's actually needs-driven, and it's hard to reach.
Right.
Those two are, I wouldn't say incompatible, but difficult in the short term.
Right.
And we have to look at this is about development. It's building capacity over time. It's far too late when the disaster strikes.
Yes.
Then you cannot start speaking localization. Sorry. You speak localization way ahead of the situation.
Right.
And then it's
right.
development.
We're going to let Eric, you were...
Yes, no, just to say that, of course, I agree with Anders' analysis. I mean, the fact that it's about power imbalances, it's definitely a power issue. That's why we are also discussing this in our own alliance of faith-based humanitarian actors and development networks. This will be the main theme at the General Assembly for the ACT Alliance late October in Indonesia, because we are challenged as sort of Northern ACT members being based in Europe and North America by the Global South, and our Southern members saying that we have assets, we have skills, we have capacities, but you bypass us. So this is absolutely a power issue. And I agree also with Anders' analysis when it comes to capacity sharing that we talk about. We don't say capacity building because our local partners have lots of capacities. They understand the contextual realities, they have the language skills, and they have to be in the driver's seat. But that is not often the case when the international humanitarian system enters and the big humanitarian NGOs are starting to operate. You don't build on the efforts, the first responders, even not going away, even going further from sort of local and national actors to local community groups. We have very good examples as the ACT Alliance working very closely together with local community groups that generate good results and outcomes, but that are sort of stifled and even bypassed by the international humanitarian system and also some of us, the strategic partner organizations that are working with Sida.
Right. Before we move on to the next question, Sophia Carlton, you were also raising your hand.
Yeah, but just quickly,
yes.
I do think that the humanitarian system has a lot to learn from the development aid and how they have been worked specifically on these issues. I think the humanitarian system has been so focused, of course, on delivering aid in the most sort of needs-based approach with the humanitarian principles at the top of it. But there is a strong discussion within the humanitarian system now about the participation revolution and how we can sort of include a better conversation with local actors. Also, I think OCHA is working on this flagship initiative where they are speaking of how we can better include local actors in the response.
Right, thank you. I would like to move on to the next question. We're going to talk about risks and finance. Very tricky issues sometimes. As we heard from the report, country and partner program staff for localizations were at times felt at odds with the messaging from audit and control functions. So this is a question of how can we balance the commitments for localization while still ensuring financial risk management? And Anna, would you like to start?
Yeah, I would like to, or I would hope to present this as a false dichotomy, in the sense that even the grand bargain is talking about increased effectiveness, efficiency. That's sort of one of the goals of a more localized approach. And I guess we tend to forget that in order to, when we work with local actors, we get a much better understanding of what's actually taking place at the front line. And we will be able to also adapt more of our funding modalities and so on to make it easier for local actors to live up to standards, and also to work on capacity building and trying to understand also what modalities works for them, rather than coming from a top-down approach. I also think, for me, it's more of a problem of capacity within our institution, that handling a project of 5 million is almost as time-consuming and complicated as a 500 million Swedish kronor project. And that is a problem, of course. We base our decisions very much on a risk assessment, and maybe we need to look at that risk assessment and try to understand what are the actual risks and how can we come up with mitigation strategies that make us feel more safe. It differs very much when you talk about a large-scale organization working all over the world as compared to a single. So I think we have some work to do as well to come up with modalities that are more adapted to the type of actor. So I suppose I don't want to see it as a natural contradiction, but rather something that it's the way we streamline our processes, and understanding of risk could be much improved, I think.
Right. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can definitely, a lot of that definitely resonates. What was interesting to us when we were doing the research is we heard findings in two different directions. On the one hand, we did hear quite a lot of critique. We did get a sense from international partners, particularly, that they felt that Sweden was becoming more risk-averse rather than less risk-averse, despite the conversations, constructive conversations they were having around localization, and they were concerned around that. But at the same time, when we spoke to some of the people in financial control functions, we were surprised to hear that there are opportunities. There's places in the system where there is more latitude around risk and to think creatively around risk. One of the things that stood out, so I was talking to Charlotte about this, one of the things that stood out was the fact that there are exemptions around counterterrorism clauses when it comes to humanitarian. That's not the case for all, but it's an indication that there can be that latitude to think differently. And when it came to talking to local and national partners and the international organisations as well about what they wanted and needed, the two things that came out there was firstly about clarity. I think when international organisations just weren't sure and they were worried about whether or not they could submit a particular kind of expense or something where they couldn't get a receipt because they were working in a place that, receipts aren't easy to come by or whatever it was, that they would towards not doing something because they're worried about breaking rules, when in fact if they'd sought that clarity or that clarity had been available to them, they might have been willing to take more risks. And the other thing is that point on co-ownership that I think you made very clearly there, Anna, is that ability to see local and national organisations as an asset in risk management. And again, one of the local national organisations that Chiri interviewed in Myanmar said, we know the risks, we're there, you're not there, we know the politics, we're on the ground, we're in the communities, we know who's who, we understand and we can navigate the risks in a way that you can't. Let us tell you and let us co-own those risks with you and co-design strategies.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists who would like to add? Eric, you were, yes, and Anders, and all of you. Eric, we start with you.
But I think that's a very important part of the report, what you have mentioned now, in terms of how to, because we are talking a lot about financial risk management with Sida. Whenever we are a strategic partner in humanitarian action or even a long-term through the some funds. So the whole question about risk sharing has been there already from the beginning. So at the policy level and also at the rhetorical level, I think we all agree But then when it comes to the actual situation, we know that the risk appetite is quite low from Sida. That is our own experience. We had a resilience pilot in Uganda, for instance, where we were only talking about the financial risk. We didn't talk about the specific risk to the partners, to the communities, when we cut off certain projects and programs. We didn't discuss that at all. So it was only about fiduciary risk. So that is our sort of our experience, not only from that, but also from other projects. I think now, generally speaking about risk, what is positive in the new government's reform agenda, and everyone knows that I've been quite critical when it comes to Sida, but what is possible there, in the first draft of the government reform agenda, they stressed localization very much. That has gone missing in the final sort of aid for a new reform era, but there are still important sentences there where they say we have to be much more, we have to share the risks, we have to work together from the humanitarian field and in long-term development. And we need to see sort of collaboration between CIVSAM and the humanitarian unit. That is even explicitly stated in the new strategy for working together with civil society organizations. So in terms of investing in our local organizations' capacity, I see that we do have that opportunity also through the new CIVSAM strategy that can then be joined up with the new humanitarian strategy. So that offers some hope and some opportunities.
Right, I see a lot of noddings there.
No, I mean, it's absolutely, and I think Eric is right, and I was kind of laughing together with Sophia because it is in the reform agenda, and I think that's one of the really strength of the agenda for reform that the government has presented, that it's so clearly really put. It doesn't use the word localization, and maybe that's a good thing, but the content is there. But I think when we speak about risk, let's start from, as far as I'm concerned, from the right point of departure. We are in a risk-avert kind of business. I think what I'm seeing, and being I see many, I mean, known faces that have been in this business for many more years than I have, and that says quite a lot. And you know, really, I think that we've seen over time a move to a situation that is, by and large, whether we speak humanitarian development, whatever we speak, that is much more risk avert. While people like me and many people in the room know that we should be moving in the absolute opposite direction. You can speak about everything from budget support to whatever it is. It's all becoming much more kind of going from what we know is the right thing to do, to give whatever the flexibility and the encouragement to partners to do what they think are the best things to do, to us, people like us. And I'm really including myself as an organization as well, having the need to control for whatever kinds of reasons. And I think the risk thing here and the risk matrix is key. What I kind of is keen to kind of put forward is that it becomes far too much a conversation on the fiduciary risk. It's about money. I mean, the big risk to partners is not about the money primarily. It's about life. And let's be crystal clear, when it really gets tough, then all of us are absent. Then it's our local partners. I did all the work in southern Syria. We were none of us, and I was with the United Nations, so, we were none of us on the ground. Because we couldn't, it was too dangerous.
Yeah.
Who were there?
Local.
Who were there? And we financed them indirectly. We couldn't even go there to do the monitoring because we thought it was too dangerous. We couldn't even provide them with an insurance so that if they were actually having a situation, they could leave. That's the reality. So let's be clear when we speak about who's risk and who define what is risk and how do we actually overcome. That is not to say that I don't understand that we need financial controllers. And I understand, and I respect Sida's kind of balance.
But there are very many risks.
There are many risks, and there is a hierarchy of risks as well.
Right, thank you. And Sophia Carlson, you wanted to add something?
No, just that, I mean, we of course recognize the risks that are out there. We do recognize that local actors are operating in these very riskful environments. At the same time, what we see now is a huge humanitarian funding gap, scarce resources. We need to sort of make sure that all those resources that we do have reaches those in most need, of course. That is why it's so important to focus both on transparency and accountability, apart from, of course, working on how we can improve the risk-sharing sort of framework that is out there together with local actors. And there is work to be done, and we are following. There is a specific sort of initiative within the Programbargen about risk-sharing framework that the Netherlands ICRC and Interaction has sort of developed. We are looking into ways on how to sort of make sure that this is being implemented, and we are sort of ready to do our part there also.
Right. We could, of course, speak more about risk, but we do have some other issues and topics that I like us to cover. So let's go to strategy, because that's another important question and another important part of how to move this localization agenda forward. And as Sophia Swithin and Charlotte and Teddy also pointed out, at the time of the writing, there were no strategy and there were no real guidelines. But since then, things have happened and things have moved forward. And Sida's unit for humanitarian assistance has set up a task team to do just that, to write guidelines and policy for localization. So can you tell us a little bit about that work and how far you are?
Yeah, we're quite happy that we have actually moved we've moved on some aspects since the report was, but we also want to thank you for this excellent report. I think it really comes at a very good time for us, because we had started this work about a year ago, and we've allocated more resources within Sida as well to work on locally led development. So I think the policy was being developed when the evaluation started, and then we actually used the recommendations that we got from you and had a workshop and tried to figure out what objectives would make the most sense, how could we in our capacity make the most to push this agenda the most as possible. And I think with the policy, it would be easier for us to work as Team Sweden as well, with clearer messages, clearer expectations possibly on our partners as well, and targets where we want to be in the coming years. We have, apart from the task team and policy being developed, we have a work plan, of course, but in that worked on trying to update our policies on overhead costs. And we feel that for us to learn now, we need to pilot a few things so that we can see in action what would make sense. So this year we are piloting together with at least 3 partners, Oxfam, NRC and IRC, as some sort of overhead modalities. So we hope that we can learn from that what would be good modalities for together with our partner forwarding more overheads to local actors. Also trying to see if we can come up with some sort of overhead framework policy that we can share with partners, so it will be easier to understand what would be possible. And we also think about developing some sort of humanitarian partnership principles. So I think this assertiveness and clarity in messaging will be extremely important for us to work in a more with a more joint effort, regardless of whether you are at Sida, the ministry, and we of course work very closely with our colleagues at the ministry as well.
Right. So and these guidelines and these this like more cohesive messaging, how do you think this will be able to drive the work forward? What are your expectations?
Well, I think it's absolutely crucial that you have clear policies and guidelines on localization, and I'm happy to hear that, Anna, that you have sort of set up this localization task force, because I think, honestly speaking, I think it was the strategic partner organizations, and we used to be a strategic partner also in the humanitarian action, having said that. But then we were talking a lot about localization, how we can support local and national actors. And then at that time, 4 or 5 years ago, it was not seen as important by the Sida's humanitarian unit. So I'm happy to hear that you're constituting this localization task force. But also during the pandemic, we talked about between different strategic partner organizations to both CFSAM and humanitarian unit that we need to have a joined up approach on localization, and you need to work together. Because then it was only possible sort of remotely supporting our local partners that were doing the work in the field. And then it was close sort of collaboration between the units and the departments. So I was sort of negatively surprised when I read the report that you're back to the silos again, and why didn't you draw on sort of the expertise that you have in the CFSAM unit to be part of the localization task force, but also from the country teams that you have at the embassies, and possibly also discussing this issue with us as major partner organizations that are discussing localization and how we can operationalize that together with our local partners. So it's a good thing, but open up the discussion and we can also bring knowledge and expertise to this.
And I think that's precisely the way it is. Of course, I welcome, and I think it's fantastic. And I really want to underline, I think we are together with a highly progressive donor. Let's be absolutely, we are, if I may put it like that, we and them. It's not my intention, but we are in a very good place. So for me, it's very much about how can we, and I hope I speak for you as well, Eric,
I hope
how
so
can
too.
we kind of encourage and enable, empower the government of Sweden to continuously stand up for what it has been standing up for over decades. I think that's a little bit where we are. I think then it's excellent that we do this kind of work, you do this kind of work, but let's also be very, very clear. It's not a policy and strategy that will change this overnight. And I think we shall have a kind of an honest kind of thinking around how much that in itself will actually mean. Because I come back over and over again, it's not that we don't know what to do. We know, by and large, what to do. It's about making actually some very hard priorities in between different, often legitimate interests. So at the end of the day, it becomes politics, and that's why I'm so encouraged by the government, the current government, that it's in its reform agenda. One of those things it has spoken about very, very deliberately over time is that we actually have to be much, much focused on the local actors. And we as the Red Cross, we see that, we feel that. They bypass us as the Swedish Red Cross and give us directly funding to our national societies. Thank you. And I'm actually not at all against. I have some internal difficulties with my controllers. They see no money. But nevertheless, I think it's a good thing.
The money is there, though.
It's in principle a good thing that we try to do this. And surprisingly, the Red Cross will today actually launch its 5-pager on precisely localization so that you can pick it up and you can, of course, implement it right away. And it's all done. So that's the response.
Very good timing for that paper. Just one moment. Anna, I would like to ask if you wanted to comment on the back to the silos. And then we move on, yeah?
No, I would agree. I mean, it also comes out clear in the report that it's when you talk to different actors, you get different messages and so on. And in a sense, I think we all agree also on the message that this is important and it's a priority. And we are very happy to see that we also get a lot of backing from the government that this should be a focus. I think from our perspective, I mean, if we want to deliver the best humanitarian aid in the world and be a leader, we need to move in this direction and we need to do better. But that's why I'm saying, because we need to learn. We don't have all the answers of what will work for us. We hope that being able to maybe pilot. I mean, the approach it has messages and targets and so on. But on our own, we also want to pilot some direct funding so that we can learn. And I think it will open up for a better dialogue with our partners. And possibly also involving partners. I'm quite happy to see that others have developed policies that we can discuss and learn from each other. Hopefully also focusing very much on the actual learning from the ground, so to speak.
Right, thank you. Yep. Sophia Karlsson, then Eric, and then you, and then we move on to the next question.
No, but just to say that we do really recognize the new policy that Sida is working on, and we do see the need for that policy, and we'll see how we will be able to sort of pick up on some of those things that are in the policy when we work on our core funding as well. I would like to also come back to the pilots, because I think those are truly interesting and also something that we could sort of learn to other donors, how they can work better on the localization, and something that we can promote further towards other donors on how. And I think there is a great interest also when we are sort of out speaking about this internationally about those pilots, so they're very, very, very welcomed.
But recognize the Americans and the Brits and the Dutch, they are very advanced now in their thinking on localization. So there's a
give and take.
Learning.
Yeah,
there's a learning.
We learned. We give them some learning about quality funding, though.
I can see.
Even more silos to break down, maybe. Eric, you want to say something?
And also, ECHO is quite advanced on sort of their policy on localization now, but I think also we can learn from the country-based pool funds where you have it also as a secondary priority, because perhaps in contrast to Anders, I think it's also important to have that when life-saving is the first priority, but to have a clear, explicit secondary priority on localization, because that will also drive change. And you've seen progress when it comes to the CBPFs, 30% pass on to local and national actors, so it matters as well.
And Sophia, you wanted to comment?
Just very quickly, I think agreeing with a lot of what everybody has said, and I think obviously, having a strategy and having nice guidelines doesn't do the work. But what we found throughout the report, and when we were speaking in all of the 11 countries that we spoke to people, and at a global level, is that there is actually some really excellent practice, and that there's individuals in embassies, in Swedish embassies, really driving very thoughtful, de-siloed change. And what having a strategy and guidance does is move that then from being something that's at the discretion and the goodwill of motivated champions and individuals and organisations. It shifts it from being discretionary to an expectation.
Right, thank you. In the presentation, you were talking about Sweden as a flexible donor and how Sweden prides itself of being a flexible donor, not micromanaging its partners. And there are many examples of how Swedish funding has been used to indirect support of local participation, local leadership. But you also pointed out that there is still resistance to power sharing by some international agencies, and that Sweden was a quiet donor. So how can Sweden leverage its influence and perhaps be more demanding on what needs to be done to drive localization forward? Maybe you would like to have a go.
Yeah, I just brings to mind what we heard from. I won't name the other donor. I'll let you guess. But one of the donors said to us, "It's just such a shame that Sweden is quiet on this. That Sweden has, 20 years ago in Stockholm, Sweden founded the Good Humanitarian Donorship Initiative, and it's got all of this global leadership, all of this goodwill, the expectations for Sweden to be vocal, as it is on many issues like flexible funding, multi-year funding, and they were really surprised that Sweden isn't using its voice, and wondering, sort of attributing motives to it, saying, well, maybe it's an intentional division of labour, that Sweden's saying, well, we'll use our platform to talk about flexible funding, and we'll let somebody else talk about localisation, or whether it was that Sweden hadn't quite got to grips with what its message and its combined Team Sweden message was on localization. But I think there was a real call for it to do so. But again, on the positive side, this goes back to this discretionary side of it that we heard in a number of countries. And obviously we've finished the bulk of our research before October of last year, but one of the places where we heard that Sweden was using it, a lot of its platform on humanitarian coordination was in Palestine, on the localization task team, was really being a very thoughtful leader there, nexus leader, but in a number of other countries as well, where Sweden really was using its position on the boards of country-based pooled funds, its embassy positions, as well as its dialogue with partners to be vocal, but it's just elevating that and speaking together.
So do you agree about Sweden being quiet, and how can maybe Sweden help drive internationally the localization agenda, Sofia Karlsson?
Well, just to start off with perhaps a little bit what you came up with as well, Sofia, when it comes to sort of perhaps the division of labor. Within the Grand Bargain, we have been truly active, of course, as you perhaps all know, in driving the issue of quality funding and flexible funding. We have been leading on caucuses, work streams, you name it. Within that work, we've also been sort of discussing the cascading of funds, how we can sort of cascade funds of quality to local actors. So that is what we have been speaking about. Other donors has been leading on the localization agenda. As of sort of the Grand Bargain 2.0, we all know that localization agenda has sort of not been sort of put forward as it has sort of was stated in the Grand Bargain. I think as of that point, we have also sort of realized that we have to do better within Sweden as well. That is why we truly sort of welcome both the objectives that are in the humanitarian strategy. There's clear objectives about localization, but also the work that Sida is now doing. So I think we are at a good place to work better on promoting it also from a donor perspective. When we were in the EU presidency in 2023, we sort of talked about this within the working group for humanitarian assistance. We had specific discussions, and also with the council conclusions that were adopted within our EU presidencies. There are clear objectives on localization and the commitments in the grand bargain. So that is something that we have been pushing forward as Sweden. So I think both yes and no.
Anders, you raise your
No,
hand.
I would actually, and it's not trying to be opportunistic, I'm serious but I think I would slightly like to defend actually the governments of Sweden in terms of actually driving. And I think having worked many years for international organizations, I think the question is a little bit about the benchmark. If Sweden is not consistently seeing the humanitarian space to be at the absolute forefront, it is seen as if you're stepping back. And we need Sweden there. I can tell you, when you are the United Nations side of things, we looked at Sweden all the time, and that was not because I was Swedish, that was because we needed so desperately the voices of those that actually wanted to do the right things. Because there are many out there that don't want to do, quote unquote, the right things. So in that regard, it's a little bit like benchmarking wherever you are, and I do get it. But with that said, of course, yes, I think that on this particular agenda, maybe that has not been, the localization workstream is actually led by my current organization, the IFRC, the Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. So I take responsibility here as well, and we have been, I have many Red Cross friends in the room right now, we've been driving from our national society side very hard for our global network, from our movement, from the IFRC, to really get all in when it comes to really putting focus on the localization, because we believe, and we are, by our nature, a localized organization.
Right.
We are, that's what we are.
Right.
So that's kind of the point of departure for us.
Thank you. Eric, you raised your hand, and then...
That's what we are as
Alexander.
well, since we are working with local faith-based organizations and local communities, so that in itself becomes an important. I think it's up to Anna perhaps to respond to that, but I come back to the benchmarks. I come back that you have a clear policy, you have clear objectives, as you said, Sophia, that will sort of guide the actions. And when you don't have that, when sort of life-saving is at the center and you don't have localization or working with local and national actors as a secondary priority, that's when you get the result in the report when Sida officials were the least convinced that localization is a priority for the institutions. So I think it's interesting to reflect on that, whereas for strategic partner organizations like yourself, it was high up on the agenda. So it shows the gap somehow.
Right.
And that's why it's interesting to hear from Anna.
And she's now going to get the word.
Thank you. No, I also think it's of course quite sobering to hear that this is the case, that we feel that there's very much a priority, but we haven't really spoken about it as vocally as we could, and made sure that all of our colleagues all over the world as well have the same messaging and understanding of what we mean when we talk about advancing the locally led agenda that we have established. I mean, it takes some time to maybe make sure that we are on track. But I also think that our partners as well welcome us to be more clear about our expectations. It's not about saying you've done wrong, but actually many of our partners have come quite far on their own and developed a lot of innovative ideas when it comes to how to work with local partners, listening to the needs, and also developed modalities. But because we have set agreements and quite maybe clear guidance on what is demanded from Sida when you have a partnership, we haven't been able to, it's like untapped opportunities to use some of those innovative ideas that comes from many of our partners as well at the moment. And I think that's also when we are more clear about our expectations, it would be possible to maybe pilot and try new ways of working. Because of course, working on localization is not one thing. We work in very complex and diverse environments, but I think, and also partners have different roles in different places. So I think we are quite open to see what can come out of a more clear expectation dialogue and consistent dialogue on these matters.
Sounds very interesting.
I hope so.
It does. Time is running, and we could stay and talk for much longer. But it's now time to wrap up before we open the floor for questions. And I would put one question to you, all of you, and brief, concise answers. The road forward, basically. 8 years after signing the Grand Bargain, the report concludes that Sweden, or Team Sweden, as I like the term, is at a crossroads and in its approach to localization. We've heard many different viewpoints and interesting takes here, and as you said, that we know what to do. So how do we do that? So how do we scale up the ambitions? How do we shift mindsets? How do we make priorities and invest across Team Sweden in localization? And what is then the road ahead? Eric, would you like to start?
Well, first of all, it's fantastic to hear that we're actually part of Team Sweden as Swedish strategic partner organizations, because that's what we've been pushing for now when sort of developing, discussing the new reform agenda of the government. So I like that idea. But I think we've talked about the important things here. We talked about sort of benchmarking, clear secondary priority. We talked about multi-annual commitments to local and national actors in terms of their funding, because it's only on an annual basis that sort of pass on of funds from the strategic partner organization. I think that's crucial. But I think for us, for ACT Church of Sweden and the Global ACT Alliance, we would like to focus on sort of the grassroots organizations and the first responders. And that is always the communities. They are responding directly. And I think the international humanitarian system has to build on that. And we have specific methods, innovative methods for involving local communities, working with flexible small grants, community micro grants, and that should be tested and scaled up. And that is something we can discuss also with you, Anna, and the humanitarian unit in terms of how to scale it up. Because we are investing a lot of efforts into that. And we discussed it in the reference group, that it was not possible to see the interaction between the INGOs and the national actors on the one hand and local communities. And to see what evidence is there that is working, because it's very good results and outcomes in terms of this cooperation that we have with this community organization. So there should be the focus also for the next EBA study. That's my final point.
So focus on communities. And Anna, right ahead.
Yeah, well, as you could probably hear, I'm quite optimistic, because at this point it feels like we are moving in the right direction and we have a lot of interesting things ahead. But having said that, I think we need to understand that it's a lot of hard work ahead, and we need to maybe also gather together with the most important stakeholders, our partners and so on. And also maybe involving local and national actors in that dialogue to come up with the best modalities that works. I think for us it's very much about having clearer policy messages, but also doing some action on the ground to learn from and be more maybe credible in what we are saying.
Right. So action, hard work, and some interesting pilots ahead. Anders.
And I think you're right. I think we are hopefully at a kind of a stage at which things seems to be happening. And this is one thing what we're hearing from the Swedish side, but we see the much larger donors out there actually also now coming to this point when there's a true realization that there's absolutely no way to be the first responder, to be the most efficient responder when it really happens, if you haven't really developed, if you haven't been working with your local partners so that they can respond. From our side, the examples are so obvious. 24 February 2022 in Ukraine, the absolute first responder was the National Society of the Red Cross. It was Ukrainian Red Cross Society. Without them, there were none. And they could only respond because they were strong, they were developed, they had capacities. All of us, the international community, we came weeks later. That's a reality. And I think that is what we were seeing in Syria, in Turkey, in so many other places. So I think we have to change the whole narrative on this one. We have to be starting to think in terms of subsidiarity. Everything that cannot best be we always have to kind of take the point of departure from the local actors. And let's be very, very clear. We speak about LNAs. That's a new abbreviation, right? Yes. The LNAs are, I mean, we are everything in between a couple of people into huge, big organizations.
Right. Right.
It doesn't really fit one size fits all.
So greater realization and the change of narrative could be the road forward.
And of course, I will give now my partners
thank you.
The answer to this question, so they can just take it.
and Sofia Karlsson.
And then that's it.
No, but I think Anders just stole my comment. I think we do need a better narrative on what we are doing. We need to sort of step up our game a little bit on the localization agenda and how we can create a good narrative on what Sweden and Swedish we are promoting as donors. So we will try to do our part together with Sida, of course, and other partners. And one step ahead that we see forthcoming is, of course, the new humanitarian strategy that we will start look into next year. So that is one part of the departure that we will have in front of us.
As a Team Sweden.
As a Team Sweden, of course,
Sweden.
always Team Sweden.
So that's for the record?
Yeah. So the new humanitarian strategy will come next year?
We will start working on it next year.
Oh, right. Okay, so we look forward to that. And Sofia Sweden, you get the last word before I open the floor.
Well, I think two things. One is just to say for us as a team of researchers, speaking on behalf of myself and Charlotte and the whole of the rest of the team who, I think some of them are on Zoom, but who aren't with us in the room today, it's immensely gratifying to see the findings of all this research plug into such an active, not just appetite for change, but process for change. That's not always a given when you write a report. So we're really pleased and really excited to see what comes next. Can I give the last word to some of the people that we spoke to?
Yes,
so 30 seconds. And I think it's this point on 2 points on, first of all, thinking big, thinking system-wide, system change, but also listening with humility, that subsidiarity thing. And there's one quote in here from an international organisation who was really keen to tell us that as long as we rely on goodwill for change to happen, it will be too slow and too little because it doesn't sufficiently disrupt the way the system is biased. And then the last word to an organisation in DRC, so a local national organisation who spoke to our colleague Gang in DRC and who was very clear, but in terms of changing the narrative, he said, no one can pretend to better know our needs than ourselves. The ideal would be to let us identify the needs ourselves and donors to provide us with the means to address them.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the panel. I will now open the floor. Oh, you can give them a hand. I would like to open the floor to questions, and there are 2 microphones in the room. Please introduce yourself before asking your questions, and please ask questions, and we leave the commentaries for another time. We have one gentleman here.
Excellent.
And then we have the lady there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, exactly.
Is this on, maybe? Yeah. My name is Johan Eldebo, and I work for World Vision. And first, thank you for a very engaging panel. It's been very good to listen to. My question is about risk tolerance, risk transfer, and risk articulation. I recently had a chance to spend some time with our Myanmar team as part of a security and strategy training. And one of our staff and one of our partners told me that there were bombs falling on them every day as they were working, but that this was fine. And it wasn't really affecting their programs. So I asked them, why did you tell me both of those things at the same time? And they said that they were afraid that if they told us all about the risks, that we would cut the funding and work somewhere safer because it was dangerous for them, and then they would lose their jobs and they would have no food. So I guess my question for you is, how do we incentivize organizations like that and people who live in those areas to keep telling us what's happening if they think they will lose their jobs if they are honest about the risks that they face?
You would like to take Anna, go first, and then Anders.
Thank you very much. I recognize this situation from other countries as well, and it's. I think, of course, the risk that the frontier local actors or volunteers experience is something that is not always picked up because those actors are not involved in maybe the decision making of projects or being asked about the actual situation. I think to some extent it has to do with funding, being able, as we began the discussion, how much overheads are you able to get as a local actor so that you can get protection through duty of care or maybe training and so on. But I think even more important is to try to see how we can work with those actors in involving them. I think in Myanmar we see that often because there is some sort of distrust between international actors and local actors. So I think from our perspective we need to make sure that those voices are actually being heard to overcome that mistrust. Otherwise it would be very difficult for any actor to get anything done, since the local actors are the only ones that can work in certain parts of the country. So I think the qualitative aspects that we started to talk about is extremely important in those contexts where it's about understanding the realities and also being part of decision making on design and so on. So I think, yeah, that would be my response.
Anders, you wanted to add something?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I gave some examples from Syria, etc., to that one. But I just take the opportunity. I think that what we're facing with is almost like we have to let our partners kind of their own self-realization about the risks. I mean, we have humanitarian partners dying now on a very regular basis, as we know. So, I mean, for me right now, the level of risk-taking by our partners, in our particular case, our national societies, is at a level that I, under normal circumstances, would find absolutely unacceptable. But they are so driven by really being able to contribute to their own communities that they take risks that from anybody's point sitting in this room would be absolutely unacceptable. They work way beyond that red little corner in your risk assessment matrix. Right. That's a reality.
Did you want to add something, Eric, or should we just move on to the
next
question?
We can move on because it was part of that,
yes.
That I was going to say. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You can hear.
Thank you so much for the discussions. My name is Khadija Saidi. I used to work for the International Rescue Committee in Sierra Leone. There's one particular quote in the report touching on capacity strengthening that says, "Capacity building is a university from which we are never allowed to graduate." So just wondering, ECHO calls for sustainable investments beyond the program cycle. Is this realistic based on your experience and your thoughts?
Of course.
Who would like to take that question?
I can start with that. Yeah, and that's actually a quote that we appropriated from the last state of the Humanitarian System report, which was also looking at these issues. And we were very much aware of it. Our colleagues Dmytro and Katerina in Ukraine gave us some very powerful evidence on this sort of top-down conception of capacity, and also a sort of capacity deficit model. So one that sees local and national organisations as being in deficit and having to come up to some sort of undefined level of capacity, rather than a positive model that sees all of the capacities that local and national organisations have and asking them what do they need. And it was very striking hearing from our colleagues Dmytro and Katerina in Ukraine how much they were having trainings and capacity building that just wasn't relevant to what they needed, was primarily actually oriented to them meeting compliance standards. So it was capacity building for them to meet compliance standards of international organisations and donors, but also very much not joined up. So each international organisation, each donor was coming in with a different training, and the hours of time when they could have been responding that were taken to attending these trainings from people who were just being flown in without knowledge of the context. So I think that reversal to being a demand-driven, positive capacity rather than capacity deficit model is one to be promoted, and one which we did see a few INGOs really working hard to model and to explore. So there is positive practice out there.
Any other answers from the?
I think just the vocabulary capacity building, I think that is in itself quite offensive. Mm-hmm. When in my years, when I remember vividly, I had an office once upon a time when I worked for another organization, and I brought all our local partners into the room, not all, but some 20 of them. And we spoke with all my UN partners in those days. Actually, now we were so proud that we actually spoke capacity building and how and this, and we wanted to engage. And they got so offended. Who are you to speak capacity building with us? Mm. And I think we have to really we have to rethink the way we speak. I mean, still just again and again and again, words matters, and the kind of vocabulary that we are using, it's so much an illustration for me on those fundamental things. And before we get those right, it's going to be very, very difficult.
Thank you. Shall we pass on to the next? Sorry, do you want to add?
Perhaps just adding to that, because it's about changing our mindsets in terms of, as you said, Sophia, if we talk about capacity building, then it's always from us, top down. But if you talk about capacity sharing, then you build on the assets and the skills and the contextual knowledge that your partners have. And that's why we have the specific method where you empower the communities, and they are themselves that sort of identify their own capacity needs. So it's not only about training on sort of complying with all the requirements that we have as back donors or strategic partner organizations. And that is a game changer if we start to look at capacity sharing in that manner.
And that again is word matters. Sorry, we have one question there, and then, yes?
I'd just like to say thank you for a great discussion today and a great report. My question is a little bit building on exactly what we were
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, sorry, yeah. My name is Colleen Heemskirk. I am the Humanitarian Director at ACT Church of Sweden, and I'm also a board member of the Core Humanitarian Standard Alliance. My question is building on a discussion that we just had, because I would like to push it further. Rather than talking even about capacity strengthening, capacity building, it's actually for us, when we talk about capacity as international NGOs, it's about demonstrating the capacity of local and national partners to meet the compliance requirements. And I think if we shift the way that we're actually talking about it, it makes a really big difference. And I'm really glad that that has come up in the discussion. But one of the things that is also a challenge, I think, for direct funding to local and national partners is the compliance and those requirements. And I know that there has been a push and a drive, and I think there's been a bit of a lack of momentum in the push to have looking at due diligence processes and combining them from donors and international donors. And I would just like to ask the panelists, is there something looking at moving forward, looking at funding and increasing funding? Can donors actually look at combining due diligence processes to make it easier for funding to come to local and national partners? Thanks.
Thank you. Anna?
Yeah, there are examples of joint funding but I think the pilots that we are looking at now are also trying out some modalities like that we work with consortia of local actors, where maybe one would take more responsibility with more capacity to deliver on those reports and so on. It's a possibility to work with pooled funding. There are lots of those examples. I think this is something that we would be happy to learn from all of you, actually. What approaches could there be? Because, I mean, from my and I guess Sida's perspective, of course, we have certain requirements, but we are quite open to see how we can maybe transfer funds and transfer autonomy to local actors in a better way, with sort of quality funding that makes sense, which might differ from context to context. So, I mean, this is a good point for us actually to pilot different ways of not overburdening each and every actor, because it's also, as I said before, quite time-consuming for us with each and every contract and so on. So, I mean, there are approaches around, and I think we need to speed up and try some of these approaches so that we can scale up faster.
Right.
Perhaps also
that's quickly, yes.
Yes, how we can engage within the grand bargain, because those discussions do occur there as well. So how we can sort of better engage in those discussions.
Right. I'd just like to move on to the next question. We have the gentleman down there.
So thank you. My name is Henrik Herber, and I will base this question from reflections working for Sida in South Sudan with development and humanitarian. And some of this is reflected in the report possibly. And I will not reiterate what has been said, because it's been an excellent discussion. Question was, when I was there working for Sida, how then the humanitarian actors can fulfill the ground bargain commitments? The short answer is they can't, because of some of the reasons that we mentioned here, and possibly also the aid architecture not allowing for these kind of things to happen. So the question basically is based on all this, and I will be short. Can we expect then, moving forward, a broader discussion? Because putting the onus on humanitarian actors to do something that is in reality is very hard and full of contradictions is too limited. Can we expect a broader agenda, including also local partners? Just as an example, the humanitarian country team in South Sudan discussing localization, how can accelerate it? apologizing that not so many local actors were in the room, unaware that at the same time there's a charter for change discussion on localization among local partners in a different room. So it's basically about getting around the table. But then that local actors will then come up with new ideas, possibly, innovative ideas. And we cannot respond to it because they may be long-term, they may be big risks, there may be things we have not put into our plans.
Okay.
So question is, can we expect a broader agenda also moving forward, not just saying how can the humanitarian actors live up to the grand bargain? How can we change the aid architecture to make it possible? That's my question.
Right, we have very limited time, so short answers. Anders, Eric, Anna, and Sophia. Yeah, go.
I don't believe in a revolution. I think I've been in the business far too long to believe that suddenly we can have a shift like this happen. But what does make me kind of optimistic in this regard is what we spoke just before. It seems to me, but it's my very personal kind of reflection, it seems to me that right now there's a point when there's a realization among the big partners in this kind of conversation that we cannot continue doing business as we did it before. There are signs of this one. And I think that's why it's so exceptionally important that a donor, and I don't just the vocabulary of a donor, for me they are a financial partner, but that's another story. But them as a financial partner, them, us, we, Team Sweden, we really then step up and say we are on. And we are really not only demanding, but we're demanding because we know that that's the only way to have an efficient, effective, and sustainable response to humanitarian situations. But then we have to get away from this one. The whole dichotomy between humanitarian development, it's fake. It's fake. So and then we call it nexus because we couldn't find another solution. So it's all kind of our kind of architecture and our kind of looking at the world that we have to kind of change the mind. Is it going to happen just overnight as a revolution? No, and maybe that's a good thing. But nevertheless, we are on some kind of a track, and I'm very encouraged by what I'm seeing from my government partners in Sweden in that regard.
Right, so let's go this last word to the government partner because we need to wrap up, unfortunately.
But I think it's important actually to talk about the revolution and the participation revolution that we see sort of happening around the world. And I want to also once again flag the flagship initiative that OCHA is leading, that South Sudan is actually piloting a country for, that specifically talks about how to include local actors in the humanitarian sort of response teams and how we can best act together with them. So I think that is something that we're looking forward to following more specifically as well.
So the government said revolution and the NGOs say evolution.
Evolution.
You see the point.
Well,
That's a nice one.
That's
I give you
interesting.
that.
The last word is going to Mats from EBA before we say thank you.
And it's my pleasure to say thank you to all of you who have made this opportunity for learning and hopefully also for start moving things ahead on this issue. So thanks to Görel who moderated, to the team, Sophia, Charlotte and Teddy who was with us on the screen, but also to Gang Karumi in DRC, to Katerina Korenkova, Dmitry Kondratenko in Ukraine, Shiri Sahau in Myanmar, who have done this magnificent work, and to the panel. Thank you so much. For the next EBA seminar, you will have to look out for a seminar online on the 29th of April. It's about aid and trade. A new report coming out. And then we'll have another seminar in May, 16th of May, where we'll present some new dissertations on democracy and its challenges. So look out for coming seminars from the EBA. www.eba.se, where you also can find our podcasts to follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.